Nice to have you back with us. It's our community, you know, and we invite so many interesting people that are our neighbors. And today, our neighbor is Dr. George Semb. Dr. Semb has retired, but for 37 years, and I won't say long years, 37 interesting years.
Yes, interesting is the operative word.
He was professor of applied and behavioral science at the Dole Human Development Center at the University of Kansas in Lawrence. And that was his real job. But he masquerades in the real job with a couple of side jobs that really are, his primary interest is designing and evaluating teaching systems. So the side jobs and the side interests are not too far away from that, because he has worked for many years in the areas of contingency managed learning. What is contingency managed learning? If something happens, what to do?
Yeah, it's consequences. Behavior have consequences, and for students realizing that their performance and so forth has consequences for grades is a lesson that you try to
instill early.
Instill early, yes.
But critical thinking and program solving skills are also scientific thinking, on-the-job training, and computer-based instruction. All skills that we desperately need more of in today's world. Just as a quick question, do you think we teach with those things in mind?
Not very many of us do that.
I don't think so.
No.
I don't, and I think it's so terrible.
No, I think it's something that needs to be addressed going forward if we're going to become more competitive, because other countries are certainly putting a tremendous amount of time, resources, parental involvement in getting their kids to be competitive.
Who pulls the trigger to start that? Where does it come from? I mean, everybody, you know, we talk about it, but
it starts in the home environment and needs to be then continued and reinforced in the school environment, where teachers are taught how to incorporate those kinds of things into their curriculum. And it's not that hard to do.
I don't think it is either.
Yes.
Now, to get to your other interest, which it really comes, I would say, from the designing instruction and putting it in small digestible pieces.
Exactly.
But this is the book.
This is one of the projects
the tome.
It's one of them that I took on, which was taking the same principles that I'd used in instructional design and applying it to something that I had gone through when I learned how to fly. And the material I used was terrible. And I said, certainly it can be done better than what I went through and what a lot of my contemporaries were going through at the time. And I was writing study guides for the books that I used in my classes at the university, and happened to have lunch with the president of this publishing company, who was lamenting the fact that he had this book on flying, but he didn't have anything that would actually teach the material. And Harold Parnes was his name. And I looked at Harold and I said, "You are looking at just that person." And he said, "Let's go back to the office and sign a contract to do that book."
To write an invitation to fly.
That's right.
Well, it must have been quite successful, because I hold in my hand the 6th edition.
And we went through 8 editions. We were about 24 years that we were used in colleges and aviation schools all over the world. In fact, one afternoon I was in Alaska, and this bush pilot landed, and I was talking to her, and she said, "Who are you?" And I introduced. She pulled out from the back of the airplane that book.
An invitation to fly. You know, it must have made you feel good.
Oh, it did. It did.
Yeah. I saw a quote, and it said, "Once you have tasted flight, you will forever walk the earth with your eyes turned skyward."
That's so true. I don't fly too much anymore, but I tell you, it was just a wonderful experience. And then to put my background to work on taking the 1,300 or 1,400 questions that the FAA selects from when they give you their knowledge exam to see whether or not you can pass that knowledge exam.
Well, it's sort of like the volume that you buy to take the graduate record exam, or the law exam, or the medical school exam. And I guess I would suggest to you that a study guide, having looked at it in advance, saves you money.
Oh, it saves you a tremendous amount of money. A tremendous amount of money.
And how so, do you think?
And, well, it cuts down the amount of time that you have to spend which is your time, which translates into you could be doing something else, that this really does cut down the amount of time. And we had a phenomenal success rate in terms of the number of students who used this book and passed the test the first time they were given it.
I worry, you know, so often you see these small planes crash, and I worry about the people who are flying them, because I think often they haven't read the book. I think, oh my goodness, and you see a lot of that.
Most of the errors are pilot errors, where pilots make mistakes of flying into bad weather and not knowing how to get out of it, or they do something stupid like running out of fuel, which accounts for about 20% of the accidents. And that's just a matter of poor planning.
Well, they wouldn't do that with their car. And but I know that the FAA does not require that the applications for the recreational pilot certificate. Now, there's a difference between a recreational pilot and the FAA seems to me to be a little lax in not requiring that they have knowledge of all the subject areas that you have presented in the study guide.
Well, this was designed for private pilots before the recreational pilot came along, and we decided that we were not going to do anything for that, that we wanted to keep our emphasis on the private pilot and people who were going to take piloting as part of a serious attempt to make it maybe part of their career, or what they would do as part of their business. So we never did address the recreational pilot.
Don't you worry about them?
I worry about them a little bit, but I also know that I think that the standards that are set for them and where and when they can fly are sufficient to protect. What you're trying to do is protect their lives and also lives of people who would fly with them.
Well, and that's the purpose of the study guide as well.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about the FAA just for a minute, the Federal Aeronautics Administration, and their involvement in pilot training and competence and that kind of thing. What exactly is their role?
There are two roles. One is on the knowledge exam. They construct a huge pool of questions, about 1,400, and they publish those. They're made available to anybody who wants to get them. And what we did with the study guide is we put them in the context of the material, so that those questions would follow something about which the student had just learned something. So we took that whole array and put it into units or chapters. The other thing that they are responsible for is overseeing the administration of the check ride, whereby somebody earns the private pilot certificate. They have to go up with somebody who is certified to give the check ride, and they have to pass it to that person's satisfaction. And it is really a very rigorous kind of flight experience. So those are the two. One is the actual flying side, and the other is the knowledge of how the airplane works, how the various forces work.
Did you ever earn a living as a private pilot, or it was only for
I did it primarily because it was just something I wanted to do, and one of my college professors had encouraged me to get my license, and this happened to be a byproduct of it.
One of the things that you talk about is the demonstrated capability of an airplane, and I think that it is extremely important, and you emphasize the fact that you must know the plane's capability and its performance.
Yes, and all of that's in the handbook that comes along with any airplane, and it's a matter of sitting down and learning.
Sometimes people don't look.
No, they don't. And
I mean, how many automobile drivers do you know that have never looked at the manual?
Oh, almost everybody never looks at the manual. But with respect to the airplane, when you start putting people and baggage and fuel into it, there are limits to how much weight it can carry. And so you have to figure out, one, what is the amount of stuff that I can take, and where is it located relative to the center of gravity of the airplane. So there are many things you have to calculate before you can legally go out and exercise your right as a pilot. So you have
and you also have to know when the danger point is reached.
Yes. And you have to know what the stalling speed is so that you don't go below that. And you have to know what other flight characteristics, like how fast you can go. And so there are many things you need to know about. And that's part of what this manual was designed to do, and that is to get people into the learning mode of being able to take that pilot operating handbook and sit down and understand it for every airplane that they were going to fly.
About 12 or 13 years ago, I was fortunate enough to take a trip to Alaska with my husband and two of our friends. We didn't take a cruise. We flew with a number of bush pilots. And I thought, whoa, you get in those little airplanes and there are 4 seats and you think, I think they've just wound the whole business up with a rubber band. But they're good.
Oh, yes, they are. Yes, they are. And they've gone extra training and so forth, especially if you're in mountainous environments. You learn how to fly in mountainous environments. You look at the effects of the winds and so forth. Yeah, but I bet that was just a spectacular trip.
Oh, for sure it was. And we flew with 3 or 4 different times, and they fly in all kinds of weather. I mean, they are the cowboys of the airplane industry, I think. But they are good. Now, are they regulated? Because those are not exactly small recreational planes.
Well,
what
they're
kind of
depends. Since you were flying with somebody and you paid that person, they are regulated much more stringently than just the normal private pilot. There's certain things that they must be able to do. They must be.
Well, some of them carry mail too. I mean,
they carry mail, and so they have to have more advanced ratings than what this book and what I have as a private pilot.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Even though the plane is small, their rating has nothing to do with really the size of the plane.
Nothing to do.
That's really interesting. See, I didn't know that. All I could think of was, this is not a terribly strong machine, and that water down there is very cold.
You shouldn't go watch some of the movies where the planes go into the water in bear country. No.
So, I thought, oh my goodness. I think night flying in bad weather are a subject that need to be discussed. Talk about night flying. What difference is there in your approach to being a pilot if you fly at night?
In my own personal experience, I was just much more cautious, much more diligently watching for weather, because at night when you fly into clouds you cannot see anything. You have to rely entirely on your instruments.
That's scary, isn't it?
Oh yeah, it is. Absolutely.
Does it take a while to be able to trust those instruments? I mean, you think, I don't know where I'm going.
You learn, that's part of the training, is you learn how to fly by instruments, so if you get caught in a situation where you are in IFR conditions, that you can.
What's IFR?
It means instrument flight rules, where you're flying solely by reference to instruments. And I got caught once, and it only takes getting caught once, and I was lucky enough that the controllers were able to talk me down through about 5,000 feet of clouds and get me on a runway in Atlanta. That was one of the scariest evenings of my life.
Have you flown at night since?
Oh yeah, I flew after that, but I was just much more cautious.
I'll bet.
Yeah.
I'll bet. You know, weather is another thing. How knowledgeable at weather? Do you have to be?
There are 2 full chapters in that manual
know.
that cover weather phenomena
and
long chapters, complicated chapters. And the reason is that most accidents occur because pilots fly into bad weather conditions that they're not able to handle. They're not rated for instrument flying, and so they get caught. And typically those encounters do not end well. So it's again something that's really.
So a good pilot checks the weather?
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
And when they go through and they do their flight briefing, they make sure that they get all the weather forecasts for what their destination is and how things are along the way.
Putting this into bits and pieces was very important, because I think it's so much. I mean, look at this.
Yeah.
It is. I thought, I don't know. I made it in aspirin here. but it's really for somebody who is not a pilot, never going to be a pilot, and never having ever thought of being a pilot. I could pull out from this interesting parts and the necessary things in general that people have to know.
It's a tremendous amount of knowledge that they have to have in order to become a safe pilot. And that's what our goal was, is to try to make that as easy to learn by designing it in a way that made the exam correspond to what goes on in learning the material that's necessary to pass it.
That's not all Dr. Semb does. He has another interest, and that is hiking. That's another one I don't think I've ever tried. And I think to myself, ooh, I don't know. You have to be in shape for that.
That's right. You do.
And you picked not an easy place to hike. This is another one of his books. Day hikes along the Pacific Coast Trail.
That's
Why'd you pick the Pacific Coast?
Pacific Crest Trail.
Pacific Crest Trail.
There's a difference between the Pacific Coast. There's really not a trail along it, but the Pacific Crest Trail runs all the way through the mountains. And my wife and I had always loved the mountains and said, we like to go hiking in the mountains. And
Had you ever hiked before?
We'd hiked some, but this was pretty much our first real experience with what I call serious hiking, where you're at high elevations, where the terrain is steep. And this would be in the High Sierra in California, and the Cascade Mountains in Oregon and Washington. And they're absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, but I have to accuse you. It says in here someplace you looked in the mirror one morning and you thought, I think I'm fat, so I need to get some exercise.
That happened a long time ago, and that's when I started pretty religiously exercising, or trying to, every day.
And
Still
that's
do.
how the hiking
And
came.
that certainly helped with the hiking, yes.
But there are risks to both of these hobbies.
Yes.
And I think that the primary objective is to limit the risks.
That is what we learned very early on. When we started out, we went to Oregon saying, okay, let's see about hiking part of this. But again, it goes back to the whole thing. Here is this huge trail, 2,750 miles.
That's a long way,
How do you break it down into manageable pieces?
See, that's what you do.
That's right. You take these huge things and break them down into a manageable, and as we went to Oregon with the intent of backpacking like 75 or 100 miles, then doing another 75 or 100 miles. And on about the third day out, I took a pretty serious fall. We had started, we always had a backup plan. And on that day, Pat took me around to 7 Mile Marsh, and she drove back to Cold Springs, I believe was the trailhead. And there was about a 20-mile section in there, and she hiked in for about 5 or 6 miles with me until I was looking up this snowbank, and she at that point left and went back and hiked in to meet me. Well, I got about 95% of the way up the snowbank, and all of a sudden it was too steep. I lost my footing, and down I go.
Oh my gosh.
And camera goes in one direction, water bottles go in other directions, and finally came to a stop.
And George Semb was flat on his back.
300 feet down the snowbank. And I was cut up, bleeding, bruised.
But alive.
But alive, thank goodness. Had I gone much further, I might have run into rocks, and the outcome might have been different.
Yeah.
But I finally got myself together, and I had to walk 6 miles back to the trailhead and another 7 miles down the road to where a couple of rangers lived that I discovered when I got there, who were nice enough to bring me in and at least put some peroxide on some of the cuts. But now my wife has, in the meantime, hiked toward me, and we were thus to meet and then hike out together. I didn't show up. So at 5 o'clock, she turned around, and we said, if I'm not at the trailhead by 6, you go back to the point where we started. And if you can't find me there, then you find the rangers and report me missing. Well, by the time she got back around, I had gone out of the ranger's house and was sitting out in their front yard, and she was just so glad to see me, and she realized I was in pretty bad shape and cut up, and so we drove into the little town to see if we could get some more hydrogen peroxide.
Which brings us to the point where good hikers always have an emergency plan.
Yes. You should never go out without having a backup that you can put into effect when somebody doesn't show up as they are supposed to.
These are the kind of maps that hikers carry, and I have to tell you, you probably couldn't go without something like this, because it does give the elevation, it tells you where the lakes are, but it doesn't, I don't see yes, the interstate is on here.
Yeah.
Well, that's important.
Oh, yes.
How to get back to the interstate.
How to get back to the road or the trailhead from which you came. It's much easier today because of GPS. And a lot of hikers do use GPS systems. But we didn't have those. We didn't have cell phones. So we had no way to contact each other.
So it's very important to have a good map. Well, even if you have a GPS, I think it's very important to have a good map.
Yes. Oh, I could not agree with you more.
Yeah.
The map really helps. And these are highly detailed maps, and we carried them for every hike that we went on. We carried our maps and didn't get lost too often. The trail is pretty well marked, but there are times when it goes across the long area and you need to be able to read the terrain and know a little bit about the elevation change. And
so you don't fall in a hole somewhere.
That's right.
Bad, that's bad, very bad. You talk a little bit, too, about what kind of a vehicle to take. I think people sometimes make a mistake by taking their family car.
We did take a family car for much of it, but it was an old family car. So it wasn't so bad when we did burn out one clutch because we ran
over. And broke an oil pan, you said.
Yeah, we did.
You have to tell the whole truth, George.
That's right. I'd forgotten about breaking the oil pan until you just mentioned it. And limping back to Eugene, Oregon to get it fixed. But it was an old car. But for this kind of country, a four-wheel drive or all-wheel drive vehicle would really be the appropriate thing. No, the family sedan is, in many cases, not the right car to have.
You talk about, and if you're in a group of hikers, being able to communicate, because you're not always in a little bunch. What kind of a plan do you use to communicate? We
used the same kind, when it was just Pat and I doing a hike. Sometimes we do the, let's hike in, meet in the middle, and go to the other way, and the other one who had the car then drives back and picks up the other person. Sometimes we had friends, and when we would go along, we'd say, okay, let's start here, and we'll hike in like 12 miles, and then we have another group of friends who would hike the other way, and we'd exchange car keys in the middle, and then when we got to the other end, we'd have a way to rendezvous.
Well, and also good equipment and good clothing and all that kind of thing is important.
You only need to be caught once. And of course we were. Even before we started hiking on the trail, we had gone with some friends from San Diego. We were all in Palm Springs. It was 110 degrees. We took the tram up to the top, and we hiked across the top to a place called Saddle Junction, which was on the Pacific Crest Trail, at which point we were in shorts and nylon jackets. And the temperature went from about 74, 75 down to 40, and the hail came, and we were being pelted with hail and cold, and we knew that hypothermia was very, very close. So we had to hike down 2.5 miles into the town of Idlewild to get out of that.
And wasted no time in doing it.
Oh, we wasted no time, as fast as we could, because we just were not prepared. Pat and I, from that point forward, whenever we went out, we always made sure we had enough layers, that we had an outer shell, and
it's very important. William Blake says, great things are not done when men and mountains meet. This is, great things are done, excuse me, when men and mountains meet. And this is not done by jostling in the street. I like that.
Yes, I like that. I like that. Yeah.
You have done many hikes in your life. What was if you had to pick one, what would you pick?
Probably our favorite area is near the Sisters Mountains in Oregon. There are three sisters, three mountains, and there's about a 20-mile hike that is just the most gorgeous. You have volcanic display as well as the mountains of the Three Sisters and Mount Washington. Looking further north, it's just an absolutely gorgeous hike. But the entire trail is really very, very special. We found there's not a hike that we regretted or that we said, oh, this is terrible, because each had their own
personality.
Personality, yes. Like the 12-foot rattlesnake. Pat said, that wasn't a rattlesnake. I said, yeah. So we drove back to look at the snake and realized just how big it was. And she said, we're not going to hike in this country. I said, oh, yes, we are.
You just have to make funny noises so they kind of go the other way.
That's right. Although some are stubborn and will not get out of your way.
Nothing ever bit you, did it?
No, well, I stepped on one. And by the time I realized
that was not good, George.
No, I know, but it only got my boot.
I
so
see.
I had high boots. Now hikers are wearing a lot lighter boots.
Are they?
Yes, yes. They're really concentrating on being as light as they can.
Well, but the new materials afford, lighter weight.
That's right.
Yeah.
In my case, I've always had ankles that were a problem, so I wore, higher boots.
Did you spend all your hiking time in the California Crest, or have you done other hikes as well that you
We've
like?
done other hikes, but by the time we got done it took 4 years to do the Pacific Crest Trail the way we did it. 1 year we did Oregon. The next summer we did the state of Washington. Each of those were about 450 miles. Then we did Northern California and finally Southern California.
George, you're so systematic, breaking things into small pieces.
That's right. And I find that that worked for this, and that also made the two books, the one we wrote about California, another one about Oregon and Washington, possible. And it's helped so many people go out who otherwise might not have and said, oh, here's a 7-mile hike I can do on the Pacific Crest Trail.
Well, and they're different lengths. In your book, he talks about the different hikes that are possible, and it gives you the length of the hike so you don't kill yourself thinking you're going to go a half a mile or 5 miles or whatever, and you end up 25 miles.
That's right. And we wanted and part of it was that we're limited by where there were places that you could join the trail, because for the most part, it's out in the middle of nowhere. And so you've got to figure out how to get to the trail to hike on it. And then maybe you're lucky enough that you end up at a road where you can then intersect and say, there, I'm done. But other times you have to take a side trail to get back down to wherever you'd parked the car.
Hopefully not fall down the side of the snow.
That's right.
Do you hear from people that have bought your books?
Oh, yeah, yeah. We have had a very active correspondence over the years with people who were a part of the Pacific Crest Trail Association, which is the advocacy group.
Now, you were the temporary president of that group, right?
I was the vice president of that group for several years. And then it just got to be, it's in California, and
you're here.
We're here. So,
but they write to you and they say, we
we've had comments from people on specific hikes who've said, hey, what about this? And and if you ever revise it, you ought to tell people about this place to go, or here is a nice little side trail that you can take that'll take you out to Peggy's Pond. So we do have a lot of comments from people who.
I think that's wonderful.
Yes.
Well, it has been one of the pleasures of your life to break things in small pieces. George.
That's right.
So whether you're hiking or flying or teaching young people or old people to think critically and think better, you've had fun.
Yes, I have.
Dr. George Semb, he is our neighbor and it's our community. Thank you for being with us, and thank you, George.
Thank you.